Support Butchers of America. Check out our GoFundMe. If you are a brand and or service, we would love your sponsorship. Please get a hold of us. Now, the show. What up, meatheads? It's Travis, American Butcher, and welcome to the Meat Block Podcast. And this is the weekly podcast by butchers for everyone. I'm coming to you live from the Priest Point Tulalip Indian Reservation here in the Pacific Northwest, where it is blustery. The sea, she's been angry for the last couple of days. Water coming over the bulkhead. Thought I was going to lose some patio furniture. I love it. And in this week's episode, David and myself talk about loosey-goosey gooseneck. So, sit back and enjoy. And while you listen to the intro, try to think if you know what a gooseneck is.
Good cutting enhances the quality of good meat. Poor cutting results in an inferior piece of meat, regardless of quality.
Have you figured it out? Well, I guess it's not really a riddle. I guess it's either you know or you don't know. So, off the hindquarter, you have the round section. And the round consists of your bottom round, and your eye round. You could take it off in one big piece and then seam it out on the bench, which is how I was trained to do, making a straight cut through the heel or the velvet. And artisanal butchers will cry shame over that, but it's hard to sell them a lot sometimes. And you kind of need that heel integrity if you're breaking on the rail. Or you could slice a double slice in your tendon and then rehook it when you get to this part. Or you may take off your top round, then remove the H-bone, and then leave the sirloin attached kind of at the bottom round because the picanha is the tip of the bottom round. And then may do a knife cut and then remove the gooseneck this way. This is all that you've removed your knuckle or your sirloin tip first. That top round, it's more versatile. It's the tenderness, or it's the most tender of any of the rounds. Uh-oh. Here comes Milo. I can't wait until after the holiday season so I could build a studio. Because right now, my laundry room where I'm going to put this studio looks like an Amazon warehouse because there's so many gosh darn boxes in it. Right now, I have to share the dining room, like with my dog, who you hear quenching his thirst, who ignores me most of the time and is really into Melissa, except for when I want to escape. He was like, hey, what are you doing? Remember me? And it's just, ugh. I took him to the groomer earlier this week, and he did not get a haircut, let's just say that. So typically you remove your sirloin tip first before you move the rest of the round portions off. If you really want to, practice your knife work, you could remove, I guess, the bottom round and then the eye round. But most people don't. They remove this whole two muscle group as one piece. And the bottom round with the eye round still attached is called the gooseneck. Now, the gooseneck cut has to have the heel on it to technically be a gooseneck. And the reason is, well, I guess not technically, but it got its name from this. Back in the old days when they'd bring in a hindquarter of beef, most shops didn't have rail systems, or they would take it off the rail and they'd do a partial break of that round section, where they would slice the Achilles tendon up near the top of the bone, peeling off this round section with the heel on it, And that Achilles tendon is the gooseneck. And then the body of the eye round and bottom round is the goose. And when you would grab this piece and manipulate it, you would grab it by that Achilles tendon or that heel meat or that heel tendon. And that would be grabbing it by the goose, grabbing it by the neck. Now, the bottom round is also commonly referred to as outside round. And that is because it is on the outside of the carcass. And then the top round is the inside round. And then I've also heard the bottom round called the flat. Now, from your bottom round, just alone with the eye round removed, you have 3 parts. You have the point, where if you were to break it in a certain way, could have the picanha still on it, or the culotte if you're here in the States. And if you don't, it's still called the point, and that has the fattier, and it has usually a fat cap on it. Then you have your center cut bottom round, which when cut correctly just looks like a big square cube. And then you have the flat, which is the part that tapers down where the heel rests on top of that, the heel meat. And from the heel meat, it's mostly mince, and I would recommend emulsifying it because it's very tough. But you also get the merlot, or the velvet sometimes referred to. But like I said earlier, a lot of times when breaking a round off, this is going to be a straight cut through this piece, but a true gooseneck would have this on it because that tapers down into that tendon, which turns into the neck, which we're grabbing it by grabbing the round by the neck. It looks like a gooseneck. Now, most shops are going to take the gooseneck and seam it out. They're going to seam out the eye round and leave both subprimals and then work from it from there. But when I was working in Vermont, living in Bellows Falls, beautiful Bellows Falls and Wyndham, we would slaughter about 19 coal animals every Friday. They plateaued. They weren't making any money at milk. And when animals don't make money at milk, to complete the food cycle, you harvest them. And about all these Holsteins and Jerseys would all go into grind. And, they had mastitis. Some of them would be dropped off on Thursday and be dead by the time we slaughter them on Friday. And we'd bone them out. And then we would bone them out. And all of it would go into grind. Except the top round and the gooseneck. Because these are lean cuts. We denude both of them. Taking the silver off the bottom round. Taking the fat cap off the bottom, the eye, and the top round. The top round would be its own separate piece. And then they would be shipped to a jerky facility where they would be sliced, marinated, and turned into jerky. These came from organic dairy cows. And that's where you get your organic dairy or your organic jerky from. Now, even though these animals were past their prime and closer to dying than people typically like to eat, this is a absolutely normal or understanding that you don't want to send fatty, healthy animals to be turned into jerky. So it closes that loop. They filled that niche. You got to be careful when you're making jerky with your fat content not to introduce rancidity. So that's why if you're a small shop, I would explore, if you can't push the round in a traditional fashion, explore making jerky. At the same time, meeting all requirements from your local health department and food safety system. Using validation studies to support your your food safety program, whatever you develop, if you want your available water to be, I think, the highest is like 0.93 with a pH of 5.3, then you need to show how growth modules won't let stuff grow in that environment. And if you want more of that information, or if you just DM me, I'm not going to bore you with that in the show. So that is something that you could do with the whole gooseneck right there, keeping these muscles connected like they were supposed to be. Don't separate them. And that way you could get long, nice, tenderish pieces of jerky. And next time you buy a big piece of jerky, look at it and see if you can find that bottom round with that tiny seam with the eye round. This next piece is by David.
Hey, meatheads. David here. Got a question for all you beef breakers out there. When you're breaking the round, how do you do it? Do you seam out each individual muscle, first taking the knuckle off, then taking the inside round with the H-bone, then the gooseneck? Do you just go straight perpendicular to the femur, scrape the femur down, and then come straight out to pull the knuckle off? Or maybe you do it like me. What I do is I make a horizontal cut about 2.5 inches south of the tendon and the heel, and go straight to the bone, and then score on both sides of the knuckle down either side of the femur. Then with a hook, I give outward pressure and just kind of pull away and cut the meat on the inside of the round, and I pull off the top, the bottom, and the eye all in one piece. From there, I've got a pretty clean femur, and of course, I've seamed out and peeled the knuckle before that. And then from there, I'm able to do my work on the individual muscles as I need to. Now, if you're trying to preserve the entire heel, especially if you want to leave the tendon on, send that out as a subprimal, that doesn't work for you. But that's kind of how I like to do it personally. And that also involves taking the H-bone out while it's hanging. I think that's more fun and comes out a lot cleaner too. So then what? Then what do you do? I break the inside round and put that on the table to be made into like a London broil style roast. And then I take off the gooseneck and I put it directly into the rendering barrel. Just kidding. I don't throw that away, but it's a couple of muscles that are particularly difficult, or it's a group of muscles, that are particularly difficult to merchandise, and I don't always enjoy eating, honestly. In the cut and wrap, of course, you've always got it on your cut sheet as stew or cube steak. Stew, it's very convenient, the shape of those two muscles, the eye and the bottom rounds, are great for cubing, but it has a tendency to dry out, and there's a lot of connective tissue in the bottom round, actually, and it really ends up being kind of tough and stringy. Then there's a cube steak, and the cuber or the jacquard or whatever, it's such a pain in the butt, and it's always the first thing that the health inspectors look at the second they walk in the door, I swear. I highly suggest adding a surcharge of at least $1 a pound for this particular value-added cut if you're at a cut and wrap, because you've got the time it takes to clean, assemble, disassemble, and maintain the cuber. The one that we had at the last place I worked would just shock the hell out of you if you even, plugged it in and weren't standing on a rubber mat and this and that. The other thing was awful. Getting out of the cut and wrap for the retail butcher, I think that this is, you've got a few more outlets, I suppose. A bottom round and an eye round roast tied up properly with a nicely trimmed fat cap. It looks outstanding. It's a beautiful cut. It's just disappointing once you take it home, I think the best use of these cuts I've ever, or the best selling use of these cuts I've seen, was in a retail shop where it was sliced super thin. I mean, like pho thin, like pho soup or what have you. Or like steakums for you Midwesterners. I think it was maybe like a 6 to an 8 or an 8 to a 10 on a standard slicer. It was sold shingled in the case, folded in such a way that it gave it height. And we'd often sell it with like a seasoned bone broth and like a pho kit, which I've mentioned before. It'd have like maybe some bean sprouts and some jalapenos and the broth, some noodles, and then this meat. And it'd make a really, really nice kind of one pot meal at home. And it was an easy sell. That being said, these shaved slices oxidize super quickly, and the following day they'd either have to go into a beef sandwich in a prepared foods department, or they just kind of maybe go into the grind. But oftentimes, since this was a larger retailer, we'd throw it out. Now, if you're not trying to sell this thing, you just happen to have these items, or let's say maybe you're going to buy a quarter beef or a half of a beef, and you've got the means to process it. I've got a couple of things I'll do at home for myself, I suppose. I don't really love bottom round, as I mentioned. I mean, it's just got a weird tooth, and what I want to use that for is I want to put that in with my shank meat as the beef for a beef and pork hot dog. Like, you could do all beef, but you'd really need to make sure that you're setting aside plenty of fat from the rest of the animal, not suet, please, but just back fat, in order to tie in to get the right ratio for that. And I'm sure we've already gone over a hot dog recipe. If not, we have one. But I'm going to use that for something different, something value added, because I just simply don't like eating that particular cut. Eye round, though, with a 1/2 inch of fat cap left on, can make a pretty awesome rare roast beef if it's sliced real thin, and seasoned up properly. So that's my suggestion to you this week. Nothing super fancy, nothing stuffed, trussed, pinwheeled, whatever. This is a brined roast that you stick in the oven and cook to a rare, medium rare temperature, and then eat on sandwiches. It's simple, it's satisfying, everybody likes it. And you could even do it up in the shop if you want, it's just as easy, especially if you have a lunch service or something like Nick over at Marrow in Detroit. They've got a lunch program where they're doing sandwiches, and this is a great way to kind of, cycle product and get some extra value out of some things that normally you can't hardly give away. So first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to, I've got the silver side off the bottom round, throwing that in the grinder or whatever. And the eye round with your cap on has been set aside. So let's say you've been breaking beef all day, you broke 2 beef, so you got 4 eye rounds. I'm going to brine it, because I think that's the best way to get a really great seasoned piece of meat that retains moisture and is nice and juicy. And this recipe is based off of 20 pounds of water, which really ends up being half or so of a 5-gallon bucket. This particular recipe right here, I think it's best used with a stitch pump, but I think you can also just use it as a submersion brine. I'm going to give you a recipe for a brine that is to be pumped, and then I'll give you a method that we've mentioned on here before, Paul Bertoli's brine math method. I'll give you that one more time, and then I'll just give you a third method where you can just wing it and hope for the best, depending on how involved you really want to get. I really recommend the pumping option if you're looking for consistency, if you're looking for a product that you're actually going to try to sell. That way you can really account for how much of the brine is taken up, because you're weighing it as you pump. And in this case, you're looking to pump it with 12% of its weight in brine. And that's 12% of the green weight or the raw weight of the roasts. So the recipe, if you're going to be using a stitch pump, is 20 pounds of water, 1.5 pounds of salt, and that equals up to a 7% salinity, half a pound of brown sugar, 1 tablespoon of fresh ground black pepper, 1 tablespoon of garlic granules, or 1 head of garlic, 2 sprigs of rosemary, a sprig of thyme, 1 bay leaf, and 1 teaspoon of ground allspice. And so what I like to do is bring this all up to, I like to bring it up to a boil. You know, some people say not to boil your brine. I find that you get better dilution if you do. So bring it up to a boil the day before you want to do this brine. And throw it in your cooler. Throw it in your walk-in, what have you, and let it cool down so it's, 34, 35 degrees to use the next day. What you're going to do is set up your pump. You've got 1 bucket for kind of the overflow, the purge from the pump. You've got 1 bucket full of your brine. You've got your vac pump. You've got a scale to weigh your meat. And you've got your tumbler or a 5-gallon bucket where they're going to reside after they're pumped. And what I actually did at my old plant is for hams and for bacons, we do this. Ham's got 20% pump, bacon's got 12%. And what we do is I had a key that I laminated, and it gave you weights of hams and bacons rounded to, I don't know, 500ths or a tenth of a pound or something along those lines. And that way, whoever was doing the pumping could take a look at the scale, look over the key, see what their target weight is supposed to be after you pump it X percent. And it was very, very quick, so there wasn't, calculating on the fly and things of that nature. So make yourself a little key. I guess if I was doing a key for things that were going to be 12% pumped, I would just make something that was between 2.5 and say 30 pounds. Just make a big key that you could look at, because you'll cover most of the pieces of meat you'll have to brine within that weight range, I think. So you'll pump your I-round or I-rounds up to 12% of their weight with this particular brine, and then either throw them in the tumbler and tumble them on half vacuum or half full potential vacuum for 3 hours, and then take it out, let the pressure off, and just kind of let them sit in there overnight. If you don't have a tumbler, I suggest just throwing them into a 5-gallon bucket and then pouring whatever the remainder of your brine is over them, just so they can kind of sit in that for at least a day, if not 2 or 3, if you have the time. Let's say that you don't have a pump and you want to do an equilibrium brine. Well, we can calculate that utilizing Paul Bertoli's method from his cookbook, Cooking by Hand, as we covered a couple episodes ago. And here's how we would do that. So let's say we need 3 gallons of water in a half-gallon bucket, or a 5-gallon bucket. I'll give you, half the bucket filled with your brine if you go with 3 pounds. So basically, to figure out how to get the perfect salinity, we're going to be using 3% salt and 2% sugar. And what the percentage is based on is the total water weight. So the water weight of the water we use for the brine and the water weight that's found in the meat. Meat, well, hell, you and I guess, too, but meat is generally 65% water. So let's say we've got 10 pounds of meat. 6.5 pounds of that meat is water, because that's 65% of 10 pounds. Let's say we need 3 gallons of water to cover it if we're going to submerge these into a bucket. 3 gallons of water weighs let's call it 25 pounds. So we'll take the weight of the water and the weight of the water and the meat. That's 25 plus 6.5, and that's 31.5 pounds. So you got your total water weight, and then you take 3% of that. That's how much salt you need. Take 2% of that. That's how much sugar you need for your brine. Go ahead and add the rest of the aromatics from the previous recipe into this brine when you bring it up to a simmer to dilute the salt and the sugar. And again, cool it down overnight so that you can use it the next day. Pour it over your meat. Don't pour the hot brine over the meat no matter how bad you want to. Don't do it. Wait for it to cool, then pour that over the meat. Let that sit for 2 to 3 days. By the time you're done there, it should be perfect. Once I take the meat out of the brine, I like to let it slack in the cooler for, say, a day, just kind of uncovered and open, and depending on whether or not you're going to smoke it, you get a little pellicle forming. Otherwise, you're just kind of letting all of that brine really permeate and in a homogeneous way. Let's say you're going to be cooking this in a space that has a range or in an oven. So whether it's at your plant or your shop or just your home, you've got a cooktop as well as an oven. Preheat your oven to 450 for a still oven and 425 low fan for convection. In the meantime, you've got your meat. Let's say you brought it up to room temp for the last hour or so while you've been fiddling around with the oven. Get yourself a 10 to 12 inch saute pan or griddle or whatever, and get it ripping hot. Salt the top of the fat cap on that eye round, and place it in the pan, fat side down. After 4 to 7 minutes, you're gonna have a really nice golden crust, and it'll take a few minutes. Don't check on it incessantly. You'll be pulling the fat off and stuff like that. Just let it cook for at least 4 minutes and then check it and see what you got going on there as far as your crust goes. Once the oven's preheated and the fat on the eye of the round's been seared and is nice and crusty, place an oven roasting rack set inside a sheet tray or a shallow hotel pan. Then you want to roast that for 15 minutes. At that 15 to 20 minutes at that 450, and then roll it back 75 degrees to finish it. I like my roast beef generally a mid-rare because I want to slice it for sandwiches and no doubt it'll be well lubricated by condiments, so we can cook it to a mid-rare. So if you have a thermometer, here's a decent guide for beef cook temps. Rare, 120, medium, 140, well, 160. It actually probably is a little lower than that because, when I take meat out of the oven, I always count on 8 degrees Fahrenheit of carryover heat. And so you could lower those temps by a little bit, but I'm just erring on the side of caution and, pathogens and whatnot. So there's your roast beef. You want to let that rest for a half an hour to, the rest of the day. And then let it cool and then slice it for sandwiches or sell it by the pound or what have you. But it's a really great recipe and it's very simple and it's a nice way to enjoy an otherwise like kind of lame piece of meat. So if you have any really great suggestions for eye round, bottom round, gooseneck combo, drop us a line and we'll share it if it isn't gross.
Riveting stuff. Thanks, David. You had me at the edge of my seat. And please share us your recipes if they're not gross. And I'm going to continue the discussion right now about the gooseneck and the bottom round, eye round combination. This is going to be very esoteric. So close your eyes and imagine. This is how I break down a gooseneck. I always start with the point facing away from me and the heel towards me. All right? You're going to seam that heel meat off and then seam off the velvet or merlot for the case. Then I'm going to use my knife, ride that fat around that gland to expose the seam of the bottom and eye round. I'm going to halfway seam it out, and then it kind of gets lost in there. And then just put your knife on your block and then just cut with the seam shape. It's technically a blind cut, but it's not that hard. Then using a breaking knife, shave off the little bit of bottom round that is on the eye round, because there will be a little bit if you do it this way. Then set your eye round aside. Take your bottom round. Remember, meat is malleable, and even though I said start with the heel towards you, don't move around the block. You're stationary. Flip your meat around. Just toss it. Now I'm going to take, a thinner knife. I'm going to fillet that piece of silver that connects to the sirloin tip off, and then remove the excess meat off that silver skin and throw that into the trim. The reason that silver's so thick is because that connects to the knee. It's a part of the tendon system that helps the animal walk. And then what are you going to do with this now semi-denuded bottom round? Well, you can make your 3 roasts out of it. Your point, middle, and flat. Like I said earlier in the episode. You could cross-cut it and make Swiss steaks. And the guy who was training me, John Steins, told his wife that if she ever wanted him to move out, or if they were done, to just cook him a Swiss steak for dinner. The Swiss steak is essentially a steak that is cooked in gravy, but it's not like it's slow cooked and it gets tender over time. I've never had it, so I may be speaking out of class, but I hear they're very tough. You could parafreeze this cut and make it into stir fry if you cut it thin enough. Turn it into stew, turn it into cube steak, or grind it. Now, the eye round, with that nice fat cap on, you could cut 1/4 inch or smaller steaks out of it, call them minute steaks or breakfast steaks, maybe jacquard a little bit of it. And those eat pretty well. Again, you turn it into stir fry, you could turn it into shaved steak, which is a nightmare. Hand cutting shaved steak. Essentially what shaved steak is if you ever denuded something, just using the heel end of a knife and then just using wrist action. Now do that to an entire muscle. But I would experiment with it. Know that it's essentially a blank canvas in the sense that it's super lean. So you could use it to thin out grind. You could use it to try out marinades, turn it into jerky. And if you find something that works for you in a small shop, I would stick with it, because it is, you could always make your grind margin on it, but if you can make more, then that's better. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this episode of the Meat Block Podcast. If you want to get a hold of us here, you could email us at themeatblockpodcast@gmail.com. You could tweet us at themeatblockpod, even though no one does. No one literally does. I don't even check it anymore. If you want to help out the show, honestly, the best way to do that is to leave a review on iTunes and then share. Just use the hashtag #TheMeatBlock. If you know someone who's in the culinary world or who's a butcher and you think they may like this show, send them a link. That would mean the world to us. The whole idea behind this podcast was to share information and build a community. We're looking for hazing stories. We haven't gotten any. If you are in the industry and when you were first starting out, you had to do some weird ritualistic pseudo-homosexual stuff, let us know about it. Hazing's dumb. Don't do it. That being said, I was heavily hazed, and I came up in that culture. And if you want to get a hold of David, he is at A Farm Butcher on Instagram. If you want to get a hold of me, I'm at American Butcher on Instagram and Facebook. And if you want to know why I haven't been playing songs at the end of the episodes, well, I don't have my mixer 100% set up. I'm just using a skeleton rig. And once I get that going, I'll be back to doing more in-depth with boom, laser noises and music. I'll be able to record Skype calls again and other things. But regardless of that, until next time, keep your knives sharp and live in the margin. And postscript. There is a podcast called Meet the Ultimate Podcast where a good friend of mine, Darren O'Rourke, was interviewed for this latest episode. Please check it out. Also, support Butchers of America.